Welcome to the debate. Today, we're not doing analysis as usual. This is more of an urgent forensic deep dive, really. We are staring directly at the collapse, the systemic high-stakes failure of the world order as we know it. And it was all signaled by one singular violent act, the U.S. intervention in Venezuela back in January of 2026.
Right, and the implications of that moment, I mean, just the image of it, the brute force, the institutional seizure, that really does define the future. We are watching the end of an era, but the question is this ending a funeral or is it a birth? And that's the central dispute.
The question is stark and it's urgent. Does this aggressive, naked return to hard geopolitics, this brazen bloc formation, does it signal an inevitable, chaotic descent into a violent dark age, one ruled purely by this new Donroe doctrine?
My position is, well, it's pretty clear. The evidence points overwhelmingly to global terror and the end of any pretense of sovereign freedom.
And I find myself struggling with that premise. I really do. While the descent is, well, it's undeniably raw and violent, I just have to reject the idea that chaos must equal final destruction. I see this upheaval as a necessary, transformative catalyst, the difficult, painful birth canal toward a new era, an era rooted in radical individual and local sovereignty. Let's just look at the image that shocked the world. January 2026, we all saw the brute force, the dramatic display of a military contingent, the humiliation of a sitting leader, Maduro, handcuffed, wearing that gray tracksuit, the uniform of a failed state. It was a terrifying, cinematic display, but we have to understand the geopolitical algebra behind it.
This was not a democratic liberation. This was a hostile corporate takeover executed manu militari. And what that means is that military force was the primary instrument. It bypassed all diplomatic, economic, or legal channels. Venezuela wasn't treated as a foreign nation. It was treated as a, quote, distressed asset, an asset holding the world's largest crude oil reserves, managed poorly and collateralized by the competition, specifically China and Russia. The whole operation formalized the Donroe doctrine. The Western Hemisphere is no longer just a sphere of influence. It is now deemed private property of the dominant Western power structure. This isn't policy, it's ownership. It signals the complete death of global diplomatic norms and a brutal return to pure resource realism.
I see why that display evokes panic. I do. But let me offer a different perspective on the sheriff kicking down the saloon door. If you look at that scene through the lens of imperial history, you don't see confidence. You see a profound weakness.
Weakness? How?
Well, when an empire is truly hegemonic, I mean, think of the British Empire at its height, or, the United States in the 1990s. It doesn't need to deploy aircraft carrier fleets. It doesn't need to film dramatic arrests. It controls entire regions with a quiet phone call to the central bank. The move in Caracas it's the spasm of a wounded animal. It's acting out of profound desperation. The global system, the dollar's centrality, its diplomatic relevance, it's all slipping away because of things like BRICS expansion, de-dollarization. The only recourse left is to build a bunker, to secure supplies at any visceral cost, because they know they can no longer project soft control across Eurasia. Trump isn't the architect of some confident expansion. He's the custodian building a fortress around the wreckage. This takeover, brutal as it was, is an admission of global failure.
Okay, but whether it's desperation or expansion, the consequence for everyone trapped inside these new borders is exactly the same: submission to force. You claim the move shows weakness, but the execution is terrifyingly simple and effective. It's the blueprint for the next century of conflict, centered on creating Fortress America, an autarkic island continent.
I see the blueprint, but
Let's just talk logistics for a second. This blueprint centers on what I call the Arctic-Caribbean axis, a guaranteed resource corridor from the North Pole all the way to the Amazon. The southern valve, Venezuela, secures heavy oil. That immediately ends dependence on the volatility of the Middle East. This is the blood that allows the dollar, which was dying as a petrodollar, to be reborn as a currency backed by the physical energy of the American continent. It's resource-backed violence, which is fundamentally stable, and it's long-term.
You minimizing the strategic cost here, a spasm that secures oil reserves, okay, it might be effective in the short term, but it shatters the very foundation of global trade legitimacy. Every nation now recognizes that property rights are contingent on military force. And besides, the very necessity of building this autarkic island proves they are vulnerable outside their own borders. They're not expanding their global reach, they are pulling their influence back to continental boundaries.
The threat is defined by the security of the corridor. And let's look north to the real genius stroke, the northern valve, Greenland and the Arctic. Why are these so vital? Because this is the new front in the war for rare earths. China currently controls depending on the mineral, 80 to 90% of the processing and refinement for elements like neodymium, dysprosium, materials critical for everything from advanced fighter jets to the green energy transition. The Arctic is the only viable reserve outside of immediate Eurasian control. So the Donroe Doctrine, applied here, secures both the energy, the blood, and the vital minerals, the brain, necessary for survival. This looks like a highly rational, long-term plan of violent isolationism, not mere flailing.
That's a compelling argument for the internal logistics of the fortress, I'll grant you that. But I would argue that internal logistics are only necessary when external control is lost. The requirement to militarize Greenland's rare earth supplies and Venezuela's oil is just an announcement to the world that the empire is failing to compete diplomatically and economically. They are closing the floodgates because they're vulnerable to global competition. The closing of this hemisphere, it's an act of contraction, not confident expansion. It tells us that the U.S. is forfeiting its global project just to survive regionally.
Contraction or not, it still leaves us trapped within these newly drawn lines. So, if we accept your diagnosis of Western decadence and violent contraction, then where does that leave the rest of the world? Do we look toward the multipolar structure offered by the East, by China and Russia as some kind of saving alternative for global freedom and stability?
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that premise at all. To look toward Beijing or Moscow as saviors is a fatal error. It's the height of geopolitical naivete. It is absolutely critical we understand that there are no good guys in this emergent structure. None.
But many analysts point to their millennial patience, their centralized control, their long-term infrastructure planning as a stable alternative to Washington's short-term chaos.
Long-term planning, yes, but directed toward a totalitarian end. China is not offering a humanist alternative. It is techno-feudalism perfected. If the Silicon Valley archons are just driven by profit and surveillance for advertising, the Beijing technocrats are surgical in their control of existence itself.
Could you clarify what you mean by techno-feudalism in practical terms for the listener?
Sure. I mean, the total merger of technology and state control, creating a digital cage. Systems like WeChat, the National Social Credit System, they are not just communication tools. They are the architecture of social engineering. Your ability to exist, to buy a train ticket, get a loan, even secure food, depends entirely on your obedience to the algorithm. It's a supercharged loyalty program where disobedience results in digital exile. A violent corporate takeover, like what we saw in Caracas, that's brutal, but a surgical digital cage, that is absolute and inescapable.
And Russia, are they not a potential check against both of these monolithic powers?
China and Russia operate purely on interest, not ideology. We saw this in the Venezuela operation. They didn't protect their political pawn Maduro because they have no friends, they only have interests. They effectively sacrificed their Caribbean position in exchange for free hands elsewhere, say near Taiwan. They simply swapped trading cards and carved up the world into hostile transactional spheres. The world is being restructured into two competing submission-based systems, one based on raw continental force, the other on digital algorithmic control.
So, If both blocks are moving definitively toward tyranny and chaos, one through brute force isolation, the other through surgical digital control, then what's the conclusion? It seems we are undoubtedly entering a chaotic, violent, dark age, structurally similar to the systemic collapse we saw around 1177 BC, where global systems fail, trade stops, and violence becomes the only mode of exchange. The outlook seems bleak. We are definitively doomed to chaos, regardless of who is in charge.
I come at this from a fundamentally different perception because I think we need to change the frequency of our observation. We are not doomed. We are being handed the conditions for transformation. This is the precise moment to invoke the Busina di Cardinuta.
The Busina di Cardinuta? The lamp of darkness? From the Aramaic texts of the Zohar? You're introducing mysticism into a geopolitical analysis of resource wars and surveillance?
I'm introducing a concept that recognizes the mechanics of existence. The mystics understood that infinite light blinds us. When everything is possible, we can't focus, we become passive. To truly see, to build, to act, we need restriction, we need hardness, we need the Cardinuta. The collapse of the global system, the fall of the democratic masks, the Donroe Doctrine's raw force, the surgical control of the East, that is the necessary hardness.
I respect the allegory, but you are suggesting that this systemic tyranny, which will result in mass suffering and submission, is some kind of macabre favor? How does the lamp of darkness stop an aircraft carrier from cutting off shipping lanes or algorithms from cutting off your bank account?
It doesn't stop the external power. It destroys the internal illusion that allows that power to function. This tyranny shatters our childish faith that salvation will come from outside sources, the UN, democratic politicians, a benevolent new superpower. The cynical realist outlook you present is completely correct about the danger, but it's incomplete. By becoming so obviously violent and dangerous, the system forces us to stop looking for an external light and to light our own internal lamp. This geopolitical darkness is not the end of history. It is the black womb from which the new era must be born. It is the necessary trigger for genuine human action.
That is a profound, if frightening, reframing of the terror. However, I have to stress that the reality of the Donroe Doctrine leading to chaotic submission is an immediate, palpable threat. It demands a practical, defensive response. The walls of the fortress are going up, and those inside will be subjected to its rules.
And that is why we must not feed the fear. We have to reject the premise of being passive victims in their geopolitical chess game. They are focused on building fortresses and waging resource wars. We have the Forge philosophy.
The Forge, a strategy for spiritual and physical survival. Explain how this philosophy protects against the realities of a collapsing global system.
It doesn't fight the system, it renders it irrelevant to the construction of parallel systems. It's a threefold strategy for rebuilding human value from the ground up, starting with radical sovereignty. If they control digital debt, we return to the barter of talents, to human skill, and to what I call hard biology, the fundamental act of growing your own food, purifying your own water, and caring for your immediate community. This is the foundation of genuine independence.
So localism focused on tangible, hard assets that can't be digitally controlled?
Exactly. And secondly, non-reaction. Do not spend a single joule of your life energy hating the Donroe Doctrine or resisting Xi Jinping. Your hate is their energy source. Withdraw your attention, let the collapsing structure fall under its own decaying weight, while you dedicate your time to building elsewhere. And finally, the architecture of the new. Building robust networks of zero architects, people focused on creation for honor and purpose, not for the system's broken currencies or debt structures.
You acknowledge the darkness, the immediate danger, yet you insist that this path of radical spiritual and physical withdrawal and parallel creation is the only way out.
We are already in the midst of the collapse. The only choice that matters is where you direct your will. Are you feeding the sunset with your fear, allowing the Busina di Cardinia to blind you with terror? Or are you actively forging the dawn with your own hands? The world is dangerous and dark. The gunmen have taken command, and the threat of submission is terrifyingly real.
I remain the cynical realist. I can't shake the urgency of the threat and the overwhelming power of the structures being built around us.
The urgency is real, but paralyzing fear, that is the submission itself. We recognize the darkness as the necessary trigger for clarity. You may think it's madness to speak of sovereignty and spirit, while empires perfect digital surveillance and roll tanks into distressed assets. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one.